This year's Mobile 1 12 Hours of Sebring saw a brand new car make its IMSA debut. It also saw some of that classic Sebring late race beating and banging under the lights, as well as just another classic Sebring sprint to the finish. This is your 12 Hours of Sebring post-race report. Now, the 12 Hours of Sebring is without a doubt an event that the fans, the teams, and the drivers all have circled on their calendar. It's one of the most prestigious events on the IMSA calendar, and this year's edition had plenty of hype to live up to. Now, this year's edition of the 12 Hours of Sebring didn't exactly have that iconic race moment that we've seen in some previous years, but that's completely okay. Because while we didn't see that, we got to see the debut of one of the most highly anticipated cars to make its IMSA debut. And we also saw a pretty darn historic run in the GTP class. Before we get into those though, I wanted to kick things off with the GTD class and talk about them a little bit. And for a class, as we talked about leading into this race, has been so unpredictable, this race kind of had a surprisingly predictable result. All weekend long, Lexus, Ferrari, and Mercedes were the class of the GTD field. Now, of course, all three of those manufacturers were expected to be strong here once again after they all had very strong runs in last year's race. But I guess what I didn't expect in this one is just how dominant these three would be. From the drop of the green flag, these three manufacturers were the class of the GTD field. In fact, they led 282 of the 327 laps in GTD. And this is a class that actually had its defining moment in the closing laps of the race. You see, we did again have that kind of iconic at this point Sebring sprint to the finish, as a full course yellow came out with 45 minutes to go in the race, which set us up for a 30-minute sprint to the finish. In that sprint to the finish, the number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes and the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus squared off for the win in GTD. Now, in this battle, it quickly became apparent that the 12 had more straight line speed, while the 57 was a bit quicker through the twisty parts of the track. And ultimately, after the 12 got held up a little bit in traffic, the 57 would try and take advantage of that. They made a bit of a bold send, made some contact with the 12, and pulled off what I would essentially call is a bump and run. They moved the 12 out of the way. The 12 was able to hang on to it, thankfully. But the 12 was never really able to recover and didn't really have the pace to catch the 57, as the 57 went on to win its second straight 12 Hours of Sebring. I personally think that this pass and this kind of bump and run is right on the line of what we want to see and what we don't really want to be seeing in the sport. Did Ellis borderline cross the line and bump the 12 a little bit too hard? It was a pretty hard shove. It wasn't just a light little love tap. And perhaps the 57 could have been a little bit more patient. After all, it seemed like that Mercedes was the quicker of the two cars and probably would have had an opportunity to make that pass shortly after. Jack Hawksworth, driver of the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus at the time, made these comments to Sportscar 365's Davey Owama post-race. So look, he's got one coming. That's racing. Obviously, I'm disappointed. But they were really fast and they were probably going to get it anyways. I think that sums it up pretty nicely from Jack right there. You know, he's obviously disappointed that the race finish came down to that. He also mentions that there's a possibility that they could have held off the 57 for the remainder of the race. But at the end of the day, this is kind of the nature of IMSA racing. There are moments where the elbows are going to come out. There's a fine line between, some good rubbings racing and crossing that line. Overall, though, it was a solid race in GTD, and picking up the win, as I mentioned, was the 57 Windward Racing Mercedes for the second year in a row. Russell Ward, Philippe Ellis, and Indy Donchi took the win, beating out, of course, the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus by 3.2 seconds, and the heart of racing Aston Martin rounded out the podium. Now, speaking of some of that elbows out racing, many people expected an elbows out battle in GTD Pro. And while we got some great battles throughout this race, what we really got at the end of the day was what I thought to be generally pretty clean, good, hard racing in this class. Now, the class saw plenty of lead changes from various different manufacturers throughout this one, but pretty well from the drop of the green flag, it was pretty obvious that there were two manufacturers that were the ones to beat, those being Porsche and BMW. Basically, from the drop of the green flag, they were going at it. The lead changed multiple times between these two manufacturers. And while, Ford and Corvette, at one point Lexus also looked like they had a strong car, they all kind of made runs in the GTD Pro class, but they didn't have that sustained pace like BMW and Porsche did. Although, to be fair, the 14 Vasser Sullivan Lexus didn't really get a full opportunity to showcase the pace that they had, as they made contact with the 48 in the middle of the race and kind of ended their chances at a solid finish. But in the end, though, in that battle between Porsche and BMW, it was Porsche that came out on top. AO Racing and Rexy would go on to take the win in GTD Pro, with Lauren Heinrich, Klaus Bachler, and Alessio Piccarello bringing home the win for Porsche. They beat out the number 48 Paul Miller Racing BMW by 4.3 seconds, and the number 1 BMW rounded out the podium. While we didn't see the elbows out racing in GTD Pro, we certainly saw some elbows out, I guess, in the LMP2 class. They just had a rough overall race, let's be honest here. And the class was mired by incidents from the drop of the green flag to minutes before the checkered flag. We saw LMP2 cars in the barriers in the opening hours of the race, causing multiple full course yellows. Everything from making contact with one another, causing somebody to spin. We saw a dragon in the barriers in Spike. And then in the closing minutes of the race, we saw even more spins and more damaged LMP2 cars. Now, the defining moment for this class was also not exactly a great one, and it came just after the last full course yellow of the race. With this final full course yellow, we had a real storyline developing, as Tower Motorsports looked like they were going to be able to rebound after their unfortunate disqualification from the Rolex and potentially rebound to win Sebring. They pulled off a great pit strategy just before the final full course yellow came out, and it looked like they were going to assume the race lead. It didn't quite work out that way. I'm not sure exactly what happened, if they just got mired back in the class split line or what exactly happened there, but Tower Motorsports would restart third behind the 04 CrowdStrike car and the number 43 Inter-Europol entry. Now, the 04 CrowdStrike, they looked poised for the win here. They had, for all intents and purposes, dominated this race. However, after leading 182 laps in this race, Malte Jakobsen, in the closing minutes, would make contact with the back of the number 13 AWA Corvette, the Rolex 24 class winner in GTD, spin them around, and ultimately that 04 would pick up a penalty. The drive-through penalty would demote them from their lead position on track back to 6th, where they would finish. Now, this left the 43 and the 8 to battle it out in the closing minutes. In the end, though, it was the 43 Inter-Europol competition entry of Tom Dillman, Bjoy Garg, and Jeremy Clark who took the win, as they managed to just edge out the number 8 by 1.1 seconds. Rounding out the podium was the number 11 TDS Racing entry. Now, if you're like me, you've probably found yourself at a race weekend with your camera wondering how the pros make their shots look so good while yours don't. If this is you, then check out Paddock Focus photography workshops. Most of the photos that you're seeing in these videos, they're done by Jamie Price, professional motorsport photographer, and you can learn from him and fellow professional motorsport photographer Drew Gibson in the comfort of your own home. Everything from how to become a motorsports photographer, how to get great shots from the spectators area. That's right, you do not need credentials to get great photos at the track. Even better, for Off in the S's viewers, Paddock Focus is giving you 10% off any of their workshops when you use promo code S's. Yes, that's promo code S's at paddockfocus.teachable.com, or you can click that first link in the description. Once again, a huge thanks to Paddock Focus for sponsoring the show. That leaves us now with the GTP class. And boy, oh boy, I think this might be a telling race for what we could be in for this year. Let's start off with a positive, though, in the Aston Martin. They debuted their Valkyrie stateside after a rocky start to that car's life in Qatar. Needless to say, though, the Valkyrie had a much better IMSA debut, despite, Sebring being a much more bumpy and challenging track on the car. Honestly, the Valkyrie kind of held its own all race long. Was it the fastest? No. Was it the slowest? I mean, honestly, there were parts during the race where they were showing pretty solid speed. But the biggest win for this car was just the on-track running time it had. The Valkyrie completed 351 of 353 laps with no major issues. That's a heck of a lot better than I think all of us really expected, and that deserves a round of applause. On the flip side, though, we had the Lamborghini SC63. After the disaster that they had at the Rolex 24, I guess you could say that it got better at Sebring, but just barely. After completing all 12 hours and finishing on the lead lap in last year's race, the SC63 could only manage 8.5 hours in this one before the car had to be retired due to floor damage. Now, it wasn't just the reliability of the car that was an issue in this one. Remember how I said that the Valkyrie wasn't necessarily the slowest car in the GTP class? Well, that's because the Valkyrie spent most of the race ahead of the SC63 on the timing and scoring charts. And yes, that was a Valkyrie car that was making its IMSA debut. It was a rough one for the SC63 once again, and look, I want to be positive about this car. I really do. But with where the car is right now, you have to think that this program is just going to be focusing on improving the reliability of this car throughout the rest of the season and making some of the much needed upgrades that we've heard discussed in the off season and after the Rolex. Now, Cadillac is the first of what I'll call the sort of core four manufacturers, and let's talk about the disappointing day that they had. I mean, overall it was a disappointing day, but there was a lone bright spot for them, and that was the number 31. That car spent a lot of time leading the field. In fact, they led 155 out of 353 laps, and through the daytime, they really looked like the car to beat. However, as soon as the sun went down, they just lost that edge in speed. They faded late in this race when the Porsches started to excel, and ultimately the 31 Cadillac would go on to finish fourth. The other Cadillacs, though, those Wayne Taylor Racing Cadillacs, they were basically a non-factor today. The number 10 made contact with the 023 Ferrari 24 laps into the race, and that sent the Ferrari into the wall hard, and as a result of this, the number 10 justifiably was hit with a stop and hold plus 60-second penalty. They would go on to fall a couple of laps down and were never really able to recover from it. Now, I know there were some comments made during the broadcast from Wayne Taylor about did the 10 actually hit the 023. Look, we don't really have any proof of anything that was said here. We do know the penalty was handed out, so we have to take that for face value. And regardless, it was the start of a bad day for Wayne Taylor Racing. It wasn't just the 10, the number 40 had a pretty bad day as well. It looks like maybe it was a mechanical issue, or perhaps it was just a driver error, but regardless, that number 40, driven by Brendan Hartley, hit the wall hard in turn 17 during the 5th hour of the race, and they would later go on to finish a distant 11th place. Now, I had high hopes for the Cadillacs justifiably, but I'm going to acknowledge that maybe I was a little bit too hopeful for BMW here. They looked strong in the lead up to the race, and in the early going of this one, it did look like they had fairly solid pace. Although it really didn't help that they kind of shot themselves in the foot with the pole-sitting number 24 BMW picking up a penalty before they even crossed the start-finish line to begin the race. Like, come on guys, these are the things that you got to clean up. If you're going to be contending for podiums and potentially a championship, these are mistakes that you can't have. But despite that, they were battling through it. They were hanging in there during the day until the 9-hour mark of this race, where another kind of odd mistake happened, this time in the pits. Here, the 60 and the 24 made contact with one another, leading to repairs for both of the cars that would take them completely out of the running for the race win. Now, despite the 24 being taken out of contention, the 25 was still in the running, and they were able to salvage something for BMW in this race, pulling off a 5th place finish. The other manufacturer involved in that little bit of a scuffle on pit road was Acura. And honestly, I think overall, Acura is probably walking away from Sebring relatively pleased. I mean, they showed solid pace all weekend long, backing up the solid pace that they showed at the Rolex, but they just weren't quite on the same level as the Porsches or that 31 Cadillac. Had the 60 not picked up that damage in the pits, I think they very well could have made things a little bit more interesting against the Porsches at the end of this race. But regardless, I think that Acura and Meyer-Shank Racing are going to be pretty pleased to be coming out of the first 2 rounds of the season with 2 podiums. And then we have Porsche. I don't really know what to say here other than just wow. This weekend they were clearly the class of the field, and in the end made their second consecutive 1-2 finish look pretty darn easy. Felipe Nasr, Nick Tandy, and Lawrence Van Thor claimed the win, and with their Rolex 24 win, also claimed the 36 Hours of Florida crown. With the win, Nick Tandy also becomes, I believe it's the 7th driver to complete the endurance racing triple crown of the Rolex 24, Le Mans 24, and Sebring 12 Hours. Meanwhile, though, the sister number 6 Porsche surprisingly didn't lead a single lap in the race, but they did come alive along with the number 7 really when the sun went down, and they charged right to the front as well. Honestly, it was just a great race and a great race weekend from Porsche, really backing up and showing why they were champions last year. They just didn't make mistakes. They managed their equipment. They pulled out the pace in that car when it mattered the most. And if you're one of their competitors in the GTP class, you better be figuring things out pretty quickly here before Porsche start to run away with the GTP class. Before we get to the championship standings, though, I just want to quickly touch on the support series that were present at Sebring. We had the Mustang Challenge present and a couple of sweeps in both the Dark Horse and Dark Horse Legends class, as Robert Noaker swept both of the races in the Dark Horse class, while in the Dark Horse Legends class, Alex Bashura won both races there. In Lamborghini Super Trofeo, it was Hampus Eriksson and Danny Formal who won both races in the Pro class. In Pro-Am, Brendan Leach and Anthony McIntosh won race 1, with Darius Trinka and Tadas Karlinskis winning race 2. In the Am class, it was Glenn McGee and Graham Doyle winning both of the races there, while in the LB Cup, it was Nick Grote sweeping the weekend. In the Porsche Carrera Cup North America, it was Riley Dickinson returning to the Pro class and sweeping both races on the weekend. In Pro-Am, it was JP Martinez who swept the weekend, and there was also a sweep in the Masters class with Scott Blind winning both of those races. In the Michelin Pilot Challenge, we saw something pretty unusual here. It was a caution-free race for a series which we've seen anywhere from 3 to 5 full course yellows in their 2-hour race the past few years, so caution-free race was a bit of a unique one. In this one, though, it was Jeff Westphal and Scott McAllister who won in their number 39 Carbon with Peregrine Racing BMW in the GS class. While in TCR, it may have been the 33 that crossed the line first, but after it was found that they had a minimum refueling time that was less than allowed in the regulations, the win was given to the number 98 Brian Herta Autosports Hyundai of Harry Gottsacker and Mason Filippi. Check out the point standings now, presented by P1 Web Development. If you're looking for a custom website, then look no further than P1 Web Development. You can check them out at p1webdevelopment.com or click the link in the description. In GTP, well, with a 1-2 standing, you guessed who's leading the championship. It's Porsche Penske Motorsports with the 7 leading with 760 points. The second place number 6 has 669 points. In a tie for third, just under 200 points behind the leader, is the number 60 Meyer-Shank Racing Acura and the number 93 Meyer-Shank Racing Acura, with the number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Cadillac rounding out the top 5. It's a close battle in the LMP2 class with the 74 Riley leading with 645 points. That's just 2 points ahead of the number 22 United Autosports entry. The 43 Inter-Europol, number 11 TDS Racing, and 52 PR1 Matheson entries round out your top 5. The close racing in GTD Pro is also reflected in the point standings as the number 65 Ford Multimatic Mustang leads with 653 points. 17 points behind them is the number 77 AO Racing Porsche. Then it's the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW, the 64 Ford Multimatic Mustang. And rounding out the top 5, just 39 points behind the 65 Mustang is the number 3 Corvette. And then there's GTD. Here it's number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes leading. 41 points behind is the number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, followed by the 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche, the number 13 AWA Corvette, and the number 96 Turner Motorsports BMW round out the top 5. Boom! Just like that, the 2025 IMSA season is in full swing. The next race won't be until April when the GTP and GTD classes take to the streets of Long Beach, but you won't have to wait very long for more IMSA videos to be posted here. I have a few in the works that I'm hoping to release in the next week or so keep a close eye out for those. But in the meantime, you can check out this video on a series you're going to be hearing about in one of those videos, the MX-5 Cup. Huge shout out to all the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, you can head to patreon.com/offinthe click that join button below. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.